Well, I'd like you to turn back with me, if you will, to Daniel chapter 5. We've read the chapter, and I want to begin tonight with a little bit of background for the chapter. Firstly, the references to Nebuchadnezzar as the father of Belshazzar. Often he is understood rather to be the grandfather of Belshazzar. Also, the aspect of security. We read in chapter 5 and verse 1, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. It sounds like a very settled, a very secure, a very confident gathering. But the reality is that the city of Babylon is under siege, that there has been for a little time, and still is, a very heavy siege of the city. And normally speaking, in conditions of siege, you would expect that there would be deprivation. You would expect that there would be a careful measuring of the stock of the city, of the supplies that are there, in order to ensure that you would be able to survive however long the siege was. The suggestion is that Babylon is such a great city, such a marvelous city, and remember in the last chapter as we considered Nebuchadnezzar, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar had been in part responsible for the great architectural works, particularly those works which are referred to as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which have never been completely understood since, but nonetheless were regarded as one of the wonders of the ancient world. And Babylon, such a remarkable city that it is understood that there would have been supplies perhaps for up to 10 years of siege. So the king has no qualms about not simply aiming to survive the siege, but feeling free to be lavish with his courtiers, with those who are his subordinates, with those who play to him as to the authority, and he is completely secure. He feels there is no way that Babylon can be taken. Now, it is a remarkable fact that there is a particular aspect of strategy which we'll refer to at the end, where the city is taken. But the king has absolute confidence. He is secure. And not only is he completely secure under the siege and able to be lavish in the hospitality that he shows, he is also blasphemous. He is blasphemous against the living and true God. You know, it is interesting to remark at this moment upon the similarity between the name Daniel has been given as the one who has been brought as a captive from Jerusalem, has been brought to Babylon and has been renamed Belshazzar, Bel's prince, whom Bel protects. And there is still, even there, a reference to the Baal, the false god. But Belshazzar means Bel, protect the king. So we see a similarity in the name of Belshazzar, and a similarity between that and the name of Belteshazzar, Daniel, whom will be called upon. But Belteshazzar reminds us, as Daniel doesn't object to the name that he's been given, that there is no need for us to be scrupulous over things. You know, sometimes people who are Christian become overly scrupulous. They see certain things as needing to be separated from, needing to be avoided. You find that things like Christmas trees can be an offence to some Christians. They say, look at that It's going back to the time when we believed in the spirits of trees and these sorts of things, and almost animism or something of that sort. And you say to them, what day is it? And they say Thursday. And you say, so you're going back to the Norse gods and to Thor. You see, if we're overly scrupulous, actually we have to sanitize our entire language. We don't, as it were, a need to make issues where no issues exist. And Belshazzar here, Daniel never objects to the name being used. He is the one whom, or the meaning is, whom Bel protects. And perhaps it would be understood by Daniel, whom the Lord protects. There is therefore this background here. And Belshazzar the king, and I want to mention that he knows all that Daniel has done. He knows what Daniel has done for his father, because he has not recognized it, but he has known it. You find that in the statement that Daniel makes to the king from verse 17 onwards. Because not only does Daniel tell the king the way in which God has dealt with his father, but he reminds the king that he knew how God has dealt with his father. Verse 22, but you, his son, might be grandson, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. The king is not living up to the light that he had been given, the light that he'd been receiving, the light that he had from his father's testimony. And we have to, the way these two chapters are linked, chapter 4 and 5, we have to see the contrast between the way in which Nebuchadnezzar is dealt with by God and the way in which Belshazzar is dealt with by God. Nebuchadnezzar, you see, God has dealt with very patiently. I suggested last time there are 3 different levels at which we can understand the dealings of God with Nebuchadnezzar. At the very least, Nebuchadnezzar is someone who, at the end of the chapter, the 4th chapter, has a sense of God as a God of destiny, and that he has a place under God in God's appointment in destiny. Then there is a sense that perhaps Nebuchadnezzar had become God-fearing, had recognized that God must govern conduct and life. There are certain Methodist congregations locally that a few years ago were absolutely askance at the way in which the Methodist denomination had adopted the national lottery, and where once they had been very careful not to receive funding from that source of gambling, suddenly that source seemed to be open to them, and there were those who were askance at this because they were God-fearing. But then there is a third level. Was Nebuchadnezzar actually converted? And when we read Daniel 4 and the end of the chapter, and particularly the last words of the last verse of chapter 4, those who walk in pride he is able to put down, that seems more of a personal acknowledgement of God's dealings, and that God has dealt with him in a particular and personal way, not simply in terms of his destiny as a king, a ruler, not simply in terms that he has, as it were, earned favour with God, which we might imagine if he has become God-fearing and seeks to, as it were, serve God in obedience, but rather that he feels that he has been humbled beneath the mighty hand of God. But with Belshazzar, that does not take place. Remarkably, of course, in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is held and kept for him through those 7 times when he is losing his reason, when he is with the beasts of the field, when his nails and hair are growing. Marvellous Sunday school lesson for the children to illustrate the hair and the feathers and the claws. It makes a wonderful lesson for the little ones. But God kept the kingdom for Nebuchadnezzar through that time of his lack of reason, his loss of reason. And yet for Belshazzar, there is going to come a very sudden and very imminent judgment, because Belshazzar, in part at least, has sinned against light. Well, you see, actually the reality is that Nebuchadnezzar had also sinned against light, because Daniel, in the opening chapters, had not only told him the interpretation of the dream that the king had had, but he had told him the dream was something that was utterly impossible. After all, if someone tells you a dream, you can at least guess at a meaning. But for Daniel, he not only told the king the meaning of the dream, he told the king the dream. It had to be God at work. And yet Nebuchadnezzar had turned his back upon it, upon that reality. And then he'd created that great image, and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had failed to bow down to that image. And Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 men. I see 4 men, and the form of the 4th is like unto the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar had sinned against light. God dealt differently with Nebuchadnezzar the king and with Belshazzar the king. God is God. And whilst we may see elements and say, I can give an explanation why God dealt differently with Nebuchadnezzar, why he dealt differently with Belshazzar, at the end of the day, God is God. And as Daniel addresses the king and speaks of God, he reminds the king here that God is the Most High God. Friends, we could emblazon that. The Most High God. We don't expect to understand his ways. We don't expect to know what God is going to do next. He doesn't always tell his people what he will do. Sometimes he does. I can give an acknowledgement of someone. Their father was extremely ill, not likely to survive the night. And this person prayed. And there came a point as they prayed when they knew that they didn't need to pray any longer. And their father recovered pretty much from that moment. And medical treatment in hospital, don't say, oh, I'm not taking the medical treatment that's advised. But God doesn't always give that same sense of assurance. He may do, but he doesn't always give that same sense of assurance. And Belshazzar here is blasphemous in a resolute way. He's sinning against light. He knows the account of what has happened to his father or his grandfather. And Belshazzar gave the command, verse 2 of chapter 5, to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple that had been in Jerusalem. They were the vessels that were designed for the service of God. And this man is saying, the God whom these vessels are to serve is nothing. And they are festivals. They are enjoying themselves. Verse 4, not only did they hold as nothing the true God, but verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. They are utterly secure. They have provisions for up to 10 years. They have a river that runs through the city and gives them water. They have walls that are impenetrable. They are utterly secure. And God breaks in a remarkable and dramatic fashion. You know, God is not bound by the way he breaks in upon us. He can break in to human life in the birth of a baby 2,000 years ago. And that baby was born almost unknown to the world. Oh, Magi come. Perhaps they'd been travelling for many months, possibly years. Shepherds? Well, there's a dispute as to whether the shepherds were the lowest of the low, as shepherds generally were, or whether the shepherds the angel appeared to as Jesus is born, whether those shepherds were actually the shepherds who were providing the lambs for the sacrifices in the temple. In which case, instead of being the lowest of the low, suddenly they were important, significant. But you see, God entered the world, almost unknown, certainly uninvited, absolutely unwanted. God breaks in the way that he sees fit, at the time when he sees fit. And he's going to break in on Belshazzar and upon those who are feasting with him, those 1,000 people at least. He doesn't break in by giving them a dream. That's what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He dreamt, and God broke in. No. These people are awake. They're in the full spirit of festivity. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared. Well, it's like a scene from a Hammer horror film. Those of you that are old enough to remember Hammer horror. The fingers of a man's hand wrote opposite the lampstand. Notice the detail of the scripture. If he hadn't written opposite the lampstand, they might not have been able to see it. But the lampstand means that it's prominent, it's visible, it's unmistakable. And the king not only sees the words that are written, he saw the part of the hand that wrote. Here is God singling out the king and beginning a work that will actually culminate in judgment for the king. I just want to refer for a moment to something that we read a week or so ago concerning a human being. Because you see, it is very easy for us to imagine that there will always be a tomorrow. That I do not need to cast myself upon Christ tonight because there will always be tomorrow, or the next day, or the next week, or the next month, or the next year. Now the Bible always addresses us, today is a day of salvation. We don't put off closing with Christ. And the hymn that I quoted a week or so ago, there is a line by us unseen that crosses every path, the hidden boundary between, and the chorus goes, the hidden boundary between God's patience and his wrath. How far may we go on in sin? How long will God forbear? Where does hope end and where begin? The confines of despair. For the king, these words are coming true. For Belshazzar, and I should perhaps say at this point, concerning the background of these things, that Belshazzar is the second ruler in the kingdom. He's effectively operating as regent, and therefore when he rewards Daniel, he will simply make him the third in line in the kingdom. The king is blasphemous. The king has God break in upon him. And the king then does something that is it's reminiscent of what his father has done. It's reminiscent of what Churchill suggested that the Americans do. Churchill suggested, I hope there's nobody here who's American, Churchill suggested that the Americans always do what is right in the end, because they will always try everything else first. Well, you can take that as Churchill not being an inspired prophet. But Belshazzar here, he, in verse 7, responds to what he's seen. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, and he spoke to the wise men of Babylon. Whoever reads this writing, tells me its interpretation, shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck. If you go to the National Gallery, I think it's room 22, Rembrandt has a wonderful rendering of this scene. And it is a very famous image that this scene has brought to pass. Well, all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing, nor they could make known to the king its interpretation. And then he is given a hand. The queen comes in, reminds him of Daniel. Just for a moment, Daniel has served faithfully Nebuchadnezzar the king. Remember how Daniel has been so concerned for King Nebuchadnezzar. He did not want any harm or difficulty or danger to fall upon Nebuchadnezzar. When we're dealing with souls, when we're dealing with individual people, we do not desire bad. We do not desire ill. Belshazzar in Daniel 4 and verse 19, as he answers the king, "My Lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies." He wanted good for the king. Ultimately, of course, he wanted the king's salvation. And I have to say, I can only give you those three answers that I've given before as to whether the king is saved or whether he has a sense of destiny, a la Churchill, or whether he has that sense of being God-fearing. But Belshazzar does not desire the king to suffer loss, to suffer harm, to suffer damage. But notice that under the rule of Belshazzar, Daniel has been put in the background. You know, sometimes the hardest thing for a Christian who's been used to serving God, who's been used to being active for God, the hardest thing is to suddenly find, perhaps there's a breakdown in health, it might be mental or it might be physical, or perhaps there's some issue where we're simply prevented from being easily with people, and suddenly the service we wanted to render, we still want to render, is simply not possible. And we're, as it were, alone. You'll find on the shelves there the biographies and the autobiographies of a man called Bull. And he was taken prisoner by the Chinese shortly after the Chinese revolution, the communist revolution in China. And he was imprisoned in China. And one of the first things that they did, the Chinese authorities, they took away his Bible. And he was left only with the Bible that he had in his heart. And the Chinese kept saying to him, if you'll simply sign this paper denying Christ, denying God, denying the Bible, you can go home, you can be free. But he would not. But he was basically alone. Very little chance of service. Oh, his captors would have seen him. But he was in a room, isolated. And Daniel, you see, seems to have lost the place of public service that he had enjoyed. He'd lost the place of prominence that he'd had under King Nebuchadnezzar. And suddenly, we might say he's been put on a shelf. No prominence. You know, one of the remarkable things about the book of Daniel, Daniel may well, in terms of his total age, be as old as John was, somewhere around AD 96 as he wrote the book of Revelation. Somewhere here, we're somewhere between 62 and 70 years after Daniel was first taken captive. So Daniel is now somewhere, depending on how old you think Daniel was when he was first taken captive, say he was 14, he's a minimum of 76 now. If he was 14 and it's 80 years, he's 94. We don't ever retire from being believers. That's the reality. But Daniel, for a little time, has been out of the public gaze, out of the public light, out of active service, as it were. It's as if he's been put in the wings in a stage theatre production, and he's waiting. But he doesn't actually know whether he's going to be asked to come back on or not. He's just waiting. And sometimes it's very hard to wait for God to restore us, for God to bring us back to some activity. Oh, there are times when God deals so graciously with us, when in backsliding we've lost privilege, we've wasted years, and that's why that promise in Joel is so precious. I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten. That's one of the most wonderful promises in the whole Bible. You know, there are people who you lose years in some measure of backsliding, and the only person who can give you those years back is the Most High God of Daniel. Isn't that glorious? That God gives you those years back. That is the most wonderful privilege. Well, Daniel, waiting in the wings, and now he's going to be brought onto the stage again. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll consider the way in which Daniel deals with Belshazzar as opposed to his dealings with Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to sing as we draw to a close 732, Lead Us, Heavenly Father, lead us, all the world's tempestuous sea, 732.